Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. The white media is reporting on a political earthquake that took place in the city of New York last week. A guy named Zohran Mamdani has become the ultimate dark horse candidate for the mayor of New York City because nobody saw this guy coming and his approval happened to be around 0% for a candidate who was running for the office. Now, the way that the white media is reporting on this guy, apparently you would think that he was some sort of political disruptor. But you'll have to listen to the very end of this morning's briefing to get my opinion about this guy. Let's go ahead and start with the obvious. The quote-unquote young upset winner of the Democratic primary in New York last week beat a slew of the most well-known and well-funded establishment Democrat whores in the city, which just goes to show how talentless and directionless all of those bought and paid for political prostitutes in that city are. And so many of them were being funded by mega millionaires and even billionaires like Mike Bloomberg. I think it's safe to say that he's political poison. If he says red, you better say black. Now, the big loser in all of this is Andrew Cuomo. He comes from New York political royalty, the Cuomo family, and he's the former governor of the state. He was so desperate for a second act, but instead looks like this is going to be his final curtain. Now, he wasn't blown out. He lost by 10 percentage points, but he lost to a complete and thorough nobody who no one had heard of before last week. This guy Zohran was massively outspent by the likes of Cuomo, which proves that while money is crucial to winning elections, we now live in an era where we're seeing the limits of what money can do. Yes, it's still cancerous and needs to be checked, but at least in some cases, money can wind up becoming a liability if you're too out of step with voters. Having too much money on hand will encourage you to take positions that you simply can't come back from. Money can still buy elections, but in this political climate, the dollar don't go as far as it used to. Now, of course, when it comes to the white media trying to make it sound as if the Democrat establishment just can't believe what it's seeing and such, let's be honest here. While he wasn't their first choice, the reality is he's still on the inside of the tent peeing out, and that's the part that's the most important to him. They would prefer somebody else, but if they have to, they will put up with this new guy if they have to. Because when a nobody comes out of nowhere and beats an entire slew of bought and paid for political operatives, that lets you know how out of step you are with the voters. He overcame all of them. And this guy went from what the white media said was 0% polling support in the beginning to now being the Democratic nominee for mayor of America's greatest city. The way that the white media is reporting on this guy, depending on how you look at things, you might think that maybe this guy is supposed to be the Democrats' answer to Donald Trump's right-wing populism, the leftist populist candidate. Mamdani is a self-proclaimed socialist. That's radical enough in and of itself. It's certainly out of the ordinary. So the Democratic primary voters rejected the likes of Andrew Cuomo for an out-and-out socialist. And that tells you everything you need to know about the mood of the voters, not just in New York, but nationwide. And while I'm not going to be singing this guy's praises, we'll get to that in a minute, the reality happens to be the Democrats have become every bit as corporatist as the Republicans. They take the same positions because they take money from the same donors. All of those white media headlines talking about how the Democratic Party was being taken over by the radical fringe, well, when something like this occurs, now the white media is starting to pipe down on some of it. They're starting to shut their mouths a little bit on that. They can't be quite so bold and strident because they thought that they could conjure magic as usual. They'll go ahead and print some headlines and the voters will follow it because they usually do. But in this case, Mamdani was able to basically buck the trend, and he did it because of the fact that the voters are sick and tired of what they've been getting. The white media can post as many headlines as it wants, but that doesn't change the fact that people are still out of money, out of hope, and out of patience. So, how could this happen in America's largest city? It shows how drastically people want the plutocrats overthrown. No, he's not everything that the white media would like to try to make him cracked up to be. But what this says about the mood of the voters is everything. The same way the voters were willing to let Donald Trump back into the White House to give the middle finger to the powers that be, now you got people in New York who are saying, let's go ahead and send a real potent message to the capitalists by putting an out-and-out socialist in charge of the place where Wall Street is. Both political parties have completely sold out to the same corporate and elitist forces who have raped the national economy for generations. And the white media has spent its time trying to demonize or ridicule or otherwise marginalize anyone who isn't firmly in the middle of this corrupt duopoly masquerading as a democracy. Everyone sees the problems, but what they don't see is anyone in either party who's willing to admit that the rich have stolen the country right out from under the people and now it must be taken back, or there needs to be a revolution. When you have billionaires in your country, what that means is there's been serious policy failures. You don't get billionaires unless you got the politicians, the policymakers who have decided that they're going to rewrite the laws for a select few. Everything from copyright law to energy policy has all been written by the wealthy to make sure that they would create a closed loop, a self-perpetuating cycle where they redistribute the wealth from the working class to the upper class. That's what they've been using their money to do. Frédéric Bastiat, a French political theorist, famously wrote, "When plunder becomes a way of life, over time men create for themselves a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it." You know, that pretty much sums up white supremacy in a nutshell. There's a saying that's popular, at least among white conservatives: socialism works right up until the moment you run out of other people's money. Well, New York City just got through giving the working class rebuttal to that one. Capitalism works right up until the moment you run out of employees to exploit and customers to rip off. Because the reality is that under a capitalist structure, you will only have a democracy right up until the moment the rich realize they can buy it. Soon as they do, they'll immediately start buying the politicians, and through them, they will have policy that allows them to take everything else and use the power of the state to just hand it over to them. Why do you think it is that whenever one of these big companies comes to your town, the politicians at the local, county, and state level immediately give these guys huge tax breaks? The kind of benefits that are never given to ordinary mom-and-pop businesses. That's the reason why most businesses go out of business in the first 5 years. They're undercapitalized. How much farther would they be able to get if the state decided that everybody gets to have a 5, 10, 15, or even 20-year tax holiday? No, they only do that for the big boys. And then what happens is their very own employees are made to pay taxes, and all of these smaller businesses, their would-be competitors, they have to pay taxes, while the mega millionaires and the billionaires are tax exempt. That's a closed loop. That is a racket. And that is so-called American democracy under capitalism. Okay, now, no summary of the Democratic mayoral primary race would be complete without discussing the city's favorite cop, Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD. Seems Officer Adams has been on paid leave, or rather suspended, because he's been laying low for a while. These days, he's still running for office, but now it's as an independent. And look at how quickly this clown Adams has fallen. He went from being the golden boy of the white establishment in New York to now being nothing more than their whipping boy. The rich and powerful in New York political circles would much prefer a Republican to an avowed socialist. Giuliani was a Republican, by the way, but if the polls make it clear that Mamdani has the overwhelming advantage, then those same white dark money donors will hold their noses and support a socialist before they support a black candidate. All right, that's the information that most of you know and that you've already heard from the white media. Now let's discuss something that nobody else is. Mamdani is an immigrant, obviously. But did you know that he was born and raised in Africa? His parents are two Indians from Uganda. Yes, this guy, his parents are Ugandan, more or less. At least they're citizens of the place. And his parents moved to South Africa after that, and that's where he grew up as a young child, which means that like Charlize Theron and Elon Musk, this Mamdani character would qualify as quote-unquote African-American. I put that in quotes in case you didn't hear me. Mamdani himself has said that his parents are East African. That's how he describes them. And of course, he made sure to take pictures with black folks, which is more than Ocasio-Cortez managed to do. Now, if his parents are Indians who were living in Uganda, that means that these people were collaborators with the British, who still maintain a significant political and economic presence in that country to the present day. I was pretty much the first person to actually challenge the white media's narratives about both Idi Amin and Robert Mugabe. Both of them were men who started off working for the British colonizers before eventually turning on them. But Idi Amin is also known for expelling a large number of Indians who had lived in Uganda because they were collaborators with the British. They carried out their own economic colonization of Uganda through the banking system. So when Mamdani says his Indian parents were Ugandans, that means they're basically colonizers. Now, he may not phrase it that way, but that's what they were. And that's the reason why his parents had absolutely no problem picking up tent and moving to apartheid South Africa. They were there during apartheid. They moved to that place during apartheid. Now, why do you think they would do that? His parents apparently must have felt that Uganda was a little bit too difficult for them to take over, so they went to a place where white power was still firmly in control. And like in Uganda, you also have a lot of Indians who white supremacy led in to act as a buffer between the white occupation regime and the South African people. And while I'm not going to say that 100% of the Indian population in South Africa are still on board with Team White Supremacy, the reality is the vast majority of them are. This is Mamdani's background. This is what the white media isn't telling you about him. While the white media is trying to simultaneously walk the tightrope of saying that this guy is bad for the establishment Democrats and this is more of that fringe stuff that the Democrats don't need, while at the same time they cannot ignore the actual tide that this guy represents because of his support, not because of him, but because of the fact that his candidacy shows exactly where the minds of the voters in New York City are, and that it's probably a bellwether for the remainder of Democrats across the country. But I don't want you to be fooled about this guy and think to yourself that your heart should go pitter-pat for him. As Dr. Noam Chomsky said, the most sophisticated form of propaganda is when something presents itself as opposition, when in reality, it's actually support. A man who the white media tries to present as political disruptor and somebody who's really shaking up the system, but in reality, especially when push comes to shove, he knows what side his bread's buttered on. After all, I remember another so-called socialist the white media made so much hay about, a man who they claimed was a political disruptor and had captured the minds of the youth. And then when we asked this socialist disruptor about reparations, he said, "That's not feasible." Truth be told, the white media was a lot more hostile to Bernie Sanders than they've been to this Mamdani character. My point, family, is that we've been here before. White power's greatest trick to keep people oppressed long term is not just purely physical and economic violence. Yes, those things are key and crucial, and white power certainly couldn't exist without it. But the most important tool the enemy uses is to put mental chains on the oppressed, and they do that through propaganda. And the biggest bit of propaganda the enemy always uses is to tell the oppressed that there's mechanisms within the system of oppression that you can use to stop your oppressor. Once people buy into that fiction, they will waste years and eventually their entire lives mindlessly trying to see if they can get the system to do what it's supposed to do. White power has always relied on the use of false choices as a way to manipulate and con the oppressed into sitting on their hands and hoping that the puppets white power puts on the ballot will actually fight the very system that put them on the ballot. This is why Neely Fuller said white power believes in taking both sides of the conversation. This is what he was talking about. You go along with Barack Obama, or Bernie Sanders, or this Mamdani character, and you think that these guys are actually challenging the system, when in reality, they're just one of the system's puppets. Donald Trump is about the closest we've seen to a true disruptor, and nobody's happy with him. Is there any black person out there truly stupid enough to think that he's pro-black? At least with the orange man, though, you have no illusions about what you're getting. That's what people hate about Trump. He confronts them with the reality of the situation that they're truly in, and that the ballot has failed. In order to bring about actual change, you're going to have to force the system to do things it wasn't designed to do. And don't expect any of these puppets from the Democratic Party to teach you how to do that, and don't expect any of them to cheer you on while you're doing it either. Look, I have not been impressed by any of Mamdani's truth be told lukewarm criticism of Officer Eric Adams and the NYPD's co-workers. The thugs in blue in New York City need to be punished. And the weakness of the lip service that he's paid to that idea has only been exceeded by the fact that he's stopped talking about any sort of police criticism in the months leading up to the election. So yeah, as far as he's concerned, he says what he's got to say to get support when he needs it, and then it's going to be time to pivot for the general election, and that's going to be his true position on the issues. We've seen that one before, too. Look, regardless of this guy's background, would it be interesting if he actually turned out to be some dyed-in-the-wool socialist who actually was going to shake things up if he genuinely was that kind of candidate? Well, it would be interesting if that happened. But what I'm saying is white supremacy is global. In the same way that Barack Obama's folks may have come from overseas, yet they got to the U.S. and went along with the same old status quo, in order for me to have any sort of confidence in Mamdani, he's going to have to bring a lot more than some dubious white media headlines and some sanitized radical rhetoric. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Ronald Waits, Sakina Collins, Craig Simmons, Minnie FBA, and Mark Stroud. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.